I'm like, put that on a fridge magnet.
Or a t-shirt.
Yeah.
Well, please send me one when you make it.
That's amazing. Welcome to Sleeping Around, where we offer a peek behind the curtain of modern sex and relationship therapy and research, bringing you insights and conversations otherwise reserved for the therapy room. I'm your host, Elena Joy, a Master's of Counseling Psychology student, content creator, and lifelong sex and relationship nerd. Enjoy the episode. Oh my god. Hello, everyone. This is the first ever episode of Sleeping Around. I actually can't believe that I'm here recording this intro, ready to release this to you all. I chose today's episode as the first because I think the subject is representative of what Sleeping Around is and is going to be. Our guest is Kate Moyle, who is a psychosexual and relationship therapist, a psychosexologist, and the author of The Science of Sex, which was published in September of 2023. She also hosts the Sexual Wellness Sessions podcast, which provides a deep dive into a different topic of sex and relationships with experts. And one of her missions is bringing normalising conversations about sex out from the therapy room and into the mainstream to help get adults get the sex education they want across the lifetime. In this episode, we talk about common sex and couples therapy concerns. We talk about sexual communication tips and losing desire and nurturing desire and reigniting the desire if you've lost it. We talk about how much sex is normal, what to do with low desire or arousal non-concordance. We cover so many fascinating topics, and so I really hope you enjoy the episode. Without further ado, Kate Moyle. So tell us a bit about your journey into becoming a sex therapist. What inspired you to get into this work? Tell us a little bit about you.
Yeah, I think I've always been someone who has been fascinated by what makes people tick. Really, it kind of developed just slowly from there, and the more I read and I went through university studying psychology, became really fascinated by the topic of sex from all these different angles, whether it was evolutionarily or why people got twitchy about it, the kind of conversations everyone was having about their sex lives. And really that's how it kind of segued into being my career, just out of being nosy, I think. And then I combined my psychosexual qualifications with being a relationship therapist, because I really felt like for me in my practice, I couldn't do one without the other.
You're mirroring kind of exactly what I hope to do. So I'm really excited to be talking with you today. I'm currently in school to become a therapist. And I'm really interested in sex therapy. I'm really interested in couples therapy. And so I assume that a lot of the work that you do with couples is working on communication, enhancing intimacy. That's kind of the juicy stuff that I want to get into. As a sex therapist who sees individuals, who sees couples, who sees various types of relationships, what are some of the most common things that you see walk through your door? So,
I mean, I think sexual communication is one, but I think it's actually something that kind of sits almost underneath everything. I often say that it's the answer that nobody wants, but it's the one that they're always going to get, which is like, we need to learn to communicate about this. And actually, ironically, it's the hardest thing for people to do. Everyone's like, I could do things you tell me to do, but don't make me talk about it. And I think that kind of reflects our attitude to sex quite a lot anyway. We don't want to talk about it, or we don't want to talk, especially not to the person that we're having sex with.
Right.
That would be terrifying. And often is, because we know that people who've had sex for 20 years with the same partner might struggle to talk to that partner about the sex that they've been having for 20 years.
That's so interesting to think about.
We fear those conversations so much, and if it's something we've never done, it's then layered with, I can't do it now because then what will they think, and then what they think of the last 5 years, 10 years, 20 years. And so many people put up with sex that isn't working for them, doesn't feel good for them, might be painful, is unsatisfying, and they don't say anything. And that is a huge problem. And, one of the biggest pieces of research we have in the UK is something called the NatSal survey, which most recently showed that 40% of people said they were dissatisfied with their sex lives. And this is huge. These are huge numbers.
40% of people said that they were dissatisfied with their sex life. Wow. So first of all, what I'm kind of hearing you say is we actually don't need to talk about any specific concerns or issues or questions because the answer is communicate. But the second thing is, if we're talking about communication broadly, what would be some tips that you would have for couples or for people who are dating or individuals to communicate more effectively to discuss their sexual needs or experiences or desires?
The first rule is it's not going to talk about itself. And I've heard the line, I just thought this would sort itself out, so many times. And the real answer is nothing in life just sorts itself out. And we always do something, or we are motivated to change something or to try something. And what's really hard about it is because we feel so paralyzed by fear of judgment or rejection or anxiety, when it comes to this part of our lives, we would always rather avoid. And what we actually have to do is approach the thing. And often what happens, particularly in, let's say, relationships with two people, if both people are feeling the same way and both people are avoiding, and then both people are kind of sitting in their zones thinking, well, they haven't said anything, so I'm not going to say anything, and I haven't said anything and they're not going to say anything. We both sit kind of in our chairs separately with the distance in between us, and it doesn't change because everyone's feeling the same.
You're like reinforcing each other in the not talking about
unconsciously, because no one wants to upset the status quo, and often we fear what will this change in our relationship, a relationship that is fine, we might be happy enough with, or we say to ourselves, everything else is great, the sex isn't perfect, but do you know what, I can handle that because I don't want to disrupt everything. What would happen, or what would my partner think, or what would they think of me? I'm out of control of what happens with that conversation. At the moment, everything as it is fine. We need motivation for change. Often what happens is people get to a point where they need something different, or they want something different, or they've had enough of not having something different. And that's the point at which they kind of feel the motivation to try something new. As humans, we're real creatures of habit, and we habituate. That is a process of human learning. We get used to things, including people, including sex. And that's why, and if you're saying what are the most common questions coming into the therapy room, that is another one, which is, we lost desire, or we feel, often people use this term lost desire. Actually, what we should say is desire changed. And it's because of routine. It's because of kind of consistency, the things that we actually like in our relationships, the reliability. And when it comes to sex, what that does is it becomes less exciting. We kind of get less of a dopamine hit from the things that feel familiar. Sex gets predictable, and what we see is a responsive drop in desire or change in desire. And we assume, because we used to have it, and at the start of relationships, this is for the majority of people, or a wide number of people, that at the start sex felt spontaneous, desire felt kind of frequent and hot and exciting, and we couldn't keep our hands off each other. And then it started to fade and started to change. We're always comparing ourselves to the us at the start, and I hear people say so often, we want to get back to how we used to be. And arguably, what you say, as an annoying therapist who likes to challenge most things that people say, is, but nothing else in your relationship is how it used to be. So why would sex be? Why can't we aim to get forward to something different? Because you guys are not the people that you were at the start. It's much easier to be very sexually free with someone you're not emotionally connected to in lots of ways.
The idea of the things that we really value in relationship, like you named safety and stability, that those are almost the antithesis of the excitement, the dopamine hits. I'm sitting here and I'm thinking, well, can we have both? Or is it necessary to recognize, well, it's the safety and stability and routine. These are the things that are important and necessary to maintain this relationship. So I choose those versus spontaneity and excitement and those kinds of things. That's more important to me, so I choose that. Do we have to pick one?
We don't have to pick one. Esther Perel talks about it as nurturing the erotic, and that there's this, I always visualize it like a weighing scales. So often as we see kind of predictability, stability, routine, safety kind of come down. What we see it exchanging with is, the novelty, excitement, the unknown, exploration. And that's where we see this balance, where it comes to sex in the context of relationships. And we don't have to sacrifice one for the other, but what we do have to do is we have to nurture it, and we have to look after it, and we have to make an effort. And we have to do that with intentionality. And I think this Hollywood kind of Disney version of sex and relationships is, if my partner loved me, they would just know. If our relationship was as great as we think it was, it would just happen. We don't have to work at this if we are meant to be together. These kind of ideas and phrases, which are very embedded into our messages about sex and relationships. And we all kind of know that they're there, because they shape quite a lot of our ideas about relationships. And even things like the phrase relationships failing being used when relationships have ended is something I quite often challenge, because if someone's been together for 5 years, they've had a great relationship, but they've grown apart, it's not working anymore, but they just know that they're going off on their separate paths. Why is that a failure if they both took a huge amount from that relationship, loved each other, built something together, but are off exploring something different and want something different for the next 5 years of their life?
Yeah, you don't see that in other arenas. Like, I'm thinking about somebody changing careers. Let's say you worked one job for 5 years, for 10 years, and you were successful at it and you enjoyed it, and you learned these new skills, and then said, I think there's this other career path that might suit me better. I'm going to try that. That would be celebrated. And nobody would say, well, you failed. Those past 5 years failed. And yet with relationships, that's the narrative.
What most of us are doing is we're judging relationship success by longevity.
Yes, not by quality.
Longevity doesn't necessarily always mean satisfaction, or doesn't always necessarily mean joy, or doesn't always necessarily mean what both people in that relationship might consider successful. And this is why I always talk about everything, and this is what the book is completely about how we approach sex from a biopsychosocial perspective, which is with an understanding of the physical and the biological. So what's happening in our bodies, our anatomy, our hormones, medications, etc. And then we have the psychological, so feelings, emotions, our thoughts, what's going on around that. And then social is social meaning, our cultural contexts, our social contexts, and how those are also shaping our experiences. And when it comes to sex, we can't look at it through only one lens. We have to look at the interaction also between all three.
So how do we use that understanding to balance those scales that you talked about earlier? Like, somebody's in a long-term relationship and they come to you and they say, we've lost the spark, we've lost the passion, help.
Well, one thing is, where are the shoulds that you're coming to therapy with? Where have they come from? So people might say, we should be having sex once a week. This is a very basic example. Who said should? This is just an idea that exists in society, but it's not a golden rule, and it's not something that our relationships have to be defined by. So that's one thing. Also remembering that if we're, say, working with two people, that their versions of these things might be completely different, and that's something that we have to navigate. Like in a relationship with two people, we have to navigate everything from our food preferences to, the mattress hardness that we like, how we like to live in our house together. I mean, the list just goes on and on and on.
Yeah.
We're navigating everything all the time. And so then it's about kind of understanding those shoulds, those ideas, how we feel about sex conceptually. What are the messages we were given about sex? Were we told that it was... This is a very gendered message, but particularly, for example, that people might be told, like in relationships, if they don't have sex with their partners, that their partner will go and have sex with someone else. So these, again, are ideas that might have been kind of given to us by society or taught to us about sex, or we might have absorbed about sex. There might be a sense of shame that we're in some way failing at sex or our relationship because we're not having sex. Where does that come from? And then the physicality is about, okay, well, also what's going on in my body, or actually it's that during the years that we've been together, one of us has experienced a sexual dysfunction or sexual pain due to medical changes that happened, or due to aging, or due to menopause, or due to being postnatal. And then the feelings are, okay, what do I, feelings and thoughts, what do I think is going on for my partner? Maybe my partner's no longer attracted to me. Okay, now I'm going to start pulling away from them, or I become anxious about sex, but I can't tell them because what would they think? And so what I might do is start to kind of pull away from them anytime they initiate any type of touch. And then I feel bad about that, but I can't say I feel bad. And so, can we see how these layers, it's one very simple example, but we have to unpick all that stuff. And I think that's what I mean when I say that sex is both simple and complicated.
So for somebody listening at home, you're saying the first piece of reigniting passion would be to unpack these kind of psychosocial pieces for ourselves?
I think the first step is saying to our partners, I've been thinking about this. How do you feel? Just even starting a conversation.
Yeah.
And also starting it with a positive, I really love you. I really love our relationship. I feel like this has changed a bit. What do you think? Often we have to be able to listen in those conversations as much as we talk, and also to be able to hear what our partner might be saying without it necessarily being the kind of receiving everything as a direct criticism of us as an individual, because often we can, because it's so vulnerable and it's so personal.
Oh, that's hard. Yeah.
Yeah, we all do. And as soon as we start feeling criticized or we start feeling attacked, we get defensive or we shut down. Or we kind of feel like we push back. So kind of positive language and trying to frame these things in a positive way. And I would say, don't have these conversations when you are just about to or have just had sex, because then that can feel like it relates to an experience that's just been had. These are conversations. It might be that you want to text your partner, it might be that you want to share an article with them, or share a podcast episode, or send something to them and say, hey, what do you think about this? Or, we watched that Netflix show last week. What did you think of the sex scene? I thought it was pretty hot. Even something like that. So using things around us.
Yeah. Yeah. You also mentioned sex in a long-term relationship needing intention and effort. And I hear the opposite a lot in mainstream kind of. It's more of a, well, if I have to schedule sex, that's the example that comes to mind for me. If I have to schedule sex, that's not exciting and something's wrong with our relationship.
That's not sexy.
That's not sexy. So can you say a little bit more about what you meant by intention and effort?
Yeah, I think the intention and effort bit is that our sex lives, like nothing else in life, just happen. But we seem to think, or many of us still hold the view that we do. And why, as psychosexual therapists, we don't talk about scheduling sex. What we do say is we do talk about scheduling time and blocking something in your calendar and prioritizing time for you to be together and intentionally making this part of your relationship a priority. Now, what you do in that time is not scheduled. You might have sex, you might not. You might be using it to connect or not, because what we do when we schedule sex is we create pressure and expectation, which for some people might be great, but for people who are struggling with sex, creates pressure, anxiety, performance anxiety, nerves, stress, and actually can have a detrimental effect. But if you are really busy people who like to organise things and you organise everything in life and you think, great, we'll apply the same rule to our sex life, that's going to work for us, and it works for you, that shouldn't be a problem. Just because you think that it is by the invisible standards that you think you're being judged by people that you're not actually being judged by. But that's the stuff that so many of us go through. And
right.
Someone gave me, and it was a colleague, gave a perfect example of it's a bit like when your best friend says to you, please, will you come to this party with me? Like, please, can we go? Please, can we go? And you go, okay, fine. I'm not really in the mood to go to the party, but all right, yeah. And then, you can't really be bothered to get dressed up and to go. But you go and you go to the party with your best friend and you have a great time. And you think, I should go to parties like this and take up these invitations more. But I just wasn't in the headspace when you called me and said, come on, please come to the party. And we can treat sex a bit like that sometimes, because many of us are coming from, when we start to think about the idea of sex, neutral, or we're distracted, we're thinking about work, we're on our phones, we're not in this ready for sex kind of sexual headspace, just kind of sitting, waiting to be approached. It takes a little bit of warming up and a little bit of, I often talk about it as kind of blending from one stage into another or switching off to turn on.
Right.
Because particularly in the modern world we're in, where there's no 9 to 5 anymore, we're completely distracted, being notified all the time, our attention is pulled in a million directions, and attention is such a massive part of sex. And then no wonder that we see people are struggling with it more.
There's so much, I'm like, oh my God, we're 30 minutes in and I have like so much I want to talk to you about. The example that you gave was a couple coming in and saying we should be having sex 1 time per week, at least, right? We kind of broke that down. One of the questions from my audience, when I told them I would be speaking with a sex therapist, a very common question was, how much sex is normal? How much sex should we be having in our relationships?
As much as you want to.
Mm-hmm.
And as much as meets the needs of everyone involved. And what we just experience is this mismatch in desire, or discrepancy in desire, is a really, really common presenting problem. And everybody wants to know how many times a week they should be having sex. And there are some kind of pieces of research that suggest one thing, but others suggest something else. Some people would say that in general, people round up how much sex they think they're having, but where the gap between partners feels bigger is where it tends to be typically a problem. So if you have a partner who's saying, I really want to have sex twice a week, and one partner who says, I would be fine to have sex twice a year, you've got quite a big discrepancy. But actually, if those partners were during that time perhaps showing each other they were interested in each other, that there was desire, that there was touch, there was sensuality, that they felt really connected, it might become less of a problem. But typically where the discrepancy becomes a problem, what we see is a leaking out into other parts of their relationship. So pulling away from each other's touch, or a drop in what we describe as sexual currency, which is a term that was coined by a colleague of mine called Dr. Karen Gurney, which is everything you do with a partner which isn't sex but positively kind of contributes to sex. So kissing, touching, flirting, cuddling up to each other, and all the stuff that I describe them as little bridges for sexual connections. So you don't have to be having sex in that very objective, this number of times measure. And also, why are we measuring it is another question. Look, put a pin in that. But we can feel like we have a good, positive sex life and sexual connection and desire. And that means a lot to people. And often when we stop having sex, the problem isn't just the act of sex. It's that I don't feel desired by my partner. I don't feel like my partner is attracted to me anymore. I don't feel like my partner even sees me. I don't feel sexy, or I've lost something about myself, and that's being reflected to me by my partner. It's all of that stuff that has such a big impact. And that's, again, where we're at biopsychosocial, because that's the thoughts and the feelings. What does it mean if we are a couple or people in a relationship that don't have sex that much? What does that mean about me if I'm someone whose partner doesn't want them? What does it mean about my partner if they aren't attracted to me? And because of metacognition as humans, which is that we think about our thoughts, we think about what's going on, we can really spiral with those processes.
So you're saying that a quote-unquote healthy sex life is the sex life that you want to be having.
Is the sex life that works for you?
Yes, is what works for both partners. You're also saying that your sex life is more than sex itself, the act of sex. That hit something in my brain to think, of this like sexual currency, and that your intimacy with your partner or partners is not just the act of sex. It's all the in-between pieces. It's the playfulness. It's the flirting. It's the feeling desired and feeling seen and prioritized, supported, all of those things. And intentionally inserting more of those pieces may lead to more or better sex in itself, if that's something that you want.
Definitely. And I think the reality is, if you spoke to the majority of couples, let's just pick a bracket, let's say couples in their early mid-30s to 50s, we'll go for a very heteronormative basic example, who have kids in the house, both work, have busy lives, the likelihood is they're probably having sex at an opportunity when it presents itself, which is we both got into bed together one evening when everybody's out or already asleep and we both aren't working late, or we're both at home and we think, right, this would be a good time. Mm-hmm. It doesn't sound sexy or romantic or exciting, but that is a lot of people's reality. And there is absolutely nothing wrong with that, providing we understand that sex is variable, that it has good days, bad days, average days, like everything else in our lives. Sometimes it's a quickie, sometimes we want an orgasm so we sleep better, sometimes we feel really disconnected and we want to feel close to each other. Sometimes we just think our partner looks really hot and we experience that kind of tingle of desire. Sometimes we've seen a really sexy scene on Netflix and it's kickstarted our arousal and we think, oh, I'll do something about that. And so we have to stop thinking about it as this really static entity, which is just sex is this act where we kind of put body parts in different places together and it means that and that's it, because we know it doesn't. We know it has so much meaning. And we also know that we can do it without any meaning at all. And it can be that. But the variability of everything that it can represent for us is huge. And I think that's the conversation that we're missing. Along with the, sometimes it's great, sometimes it's quick, sometimes it's short, sometimes it's amazing, sometimes it's too long, sometimes it's, because everything else in life we accept flexibility and variability with. And also when you say sex and I say sex, we might not mean exactly the same thing. So how do we explore that together? I think it's just such a basic principle we apply to everything else and we haven't really applied in the same way to sex as a concept.
And so for a couple who is experiencing a desire discrepancy, right? The issue maybe isn't that the spark has gone. The problem is my partner wants way more sex than I do, or my partner wants way less sex than I do. Where do you go with that?
But it's like anything in a relationship, we have to be able to negotiate it and we have to be able to explore what it represents to both of us, where things like masturbation might come into that if one partner has a much higher kind of need or want for physical pleasure as a part of their lives. Or is it that you have one partner who feels insecure if they aren't having a regular sexual contact with their partner, and it's tapping into that and the other person saying, what are you talking about? Like, I'm here every day. Mm-hmm. And I think sometimes it's just breaking that stuff down and then having a better understanding of each other, because when we misunderstand each other, which is one of the most common things for couples to do, mind reading, I think I know what you're thinking before you even say it, so I'm actually not going to listen to what you say. Super common. Often we've already made up the story about what we think is going on before our partners even have a chance to tell us. And I think sometimes pulling back from that and saying, okay, well, let's talk about this, but understanding, that there might be weeks when we're highly stressed. Sex for the majority of people, Emily Nagoski would say kind of about 80% of people, 85% of people, when they're stressed, their kind of want for sex or desire for sex decreases. But for some people, as far as that other kind of small percentage, when they're stressed, they might want to have sex more because it works as a stress relief. And it's just the perfect example of how the same situation can drive people in completely different directions. But if we don't understand that about each other as a basic premise, then it's going to be quite a confusing situation if we're both in the same thing and reacting completely differently. The likelihood of being perfectly sexually matched is tiny in comparison to this not perfectly sexually aligned version or idea of sex, because you are two different people with two different bodies, two different needs, two different minds, two different upbringings. To be perfectly sexually aligned in every single way as a couple is highly, highly unlikely. You are much more likely to have your version of sex and your version of sex when we work out our version together, whatever that may look like.
Well, and the understanding, or at least the attempt to understand where your partner is coming from, whether that be a desire or lack of desire. Like, I'm hearing you say that there are a lot of reasons that someone might want to have sex that aren't just physical. Mm-hmm. And there are a lot of reasons that someone might not want to have sex that aren't just physical. And we create these narratives and these stories in our head about what's happening for our partner and why they're behaving the way that they are, that might not necessarily be true if we don't ask them.
Totally.
Okay, so that's one desire discrepancy we've kind of chatted about.
But the one thing I realized we haven't actually mentioned there is the difference between desire and arousal. So desire, our psychology, our motivation for sex, our kind of psychological interest in sex, if you want to think about it that way. Arousal, the body's physical process of preparing for sex and getting ready for sex. So sometimes we confuse those terms, and it's understanding that desire and our motivation is shaped by everything in our lives, and sex is always in context. And so someone might experience arousal, which is that physical turn on, but it might feel like their head isn't on their side, their mind isn't on their side. We call that non-concordance, when body and mind kind of feel out of sync. And someone might be feeling really interested in sex and kind of really wanting to move things forward with their partner, but they might not be experiencing the physical arousal. And an example of this could be someone who is perimenopausal and experiencing vaginal dryness due to reduced estrogen, and sex is painful for them at that time. And so they aren't having the physical symptoms that they want, which bring them up to match their desire. So we might sometimes need to do things or make adaptations to our sex lives to help with either of those.
Okay, so that actually ties into something that I also saw my audience asking around, I'm mentally turned on, I want to have sex, but my body doesn't respond. What do I do? Is there something wrong with me? Or the flip side of that, I had somebody ask, I'll read the exact question. Somebody specifically said, sometimes my body gets turned on by things I don't actually want or even am afraid of. Why does this happen?
Oh, that's a great question.
I think that specific question we should get to in the Patreon extended version, because I want to get to it, but I think I tend to leave the audience questions for the extended Patreon. But the non-concordance piece.
Yeah, so arousal non-concordance, we know, is much more common in women. That they experience mind and body feeling out of sync a lot more than men. And
this is cis women or cis men?
Yes, cis women and cis men. So that's what the research has been conducted on at the moment. Obviously it would be amazing to kind of have further research on trans, gender expansive, non-binary people. Fingers crossed the next wave of research will start to be much more inclusive. It's gotta
be. We're manifesting it.
It can't not be, can it?
Yeah, exactly.
But sex research basically only really started in the 60s when we think about that, with people like Masters and Johnson. So in terms of where we're at, it's all fairly new, and very gendered, very heteronormative. Women's health in general obviously massively lags behind men's health in terms of research and investigations. And so all of that is happening in the context of sexual wellness anyway. But when we think about that kind of mind and body in sync things, there are a few things going on. So one is physical arousal, one is psychological arousal, and the other is mindfulness, attention, being in the moment. And these are what we talk about as the good conditions. Again, they're a kind of interrelated triangle of the three things happening. So we could be getting a type of physical stimulation that our brain responds to as sexually relevant, which could explain why someone, let's just pick an example, is like sitting at the back of the bus and they suddenly kind of feel like they're slightly turned on and they're like, what's going on? And it's because of like the physical sensations of like the bus rumbling, and it's that their brain has responded to like a physical sensation which is coded as relevant to sex, and that person has read that context is not an appropriate context for sex, so they're not actually individually psychologically turned on because what is happening is not a turn on for them personally, and they aren't going to obviously then feel ready or open for sex because the context isn't right, and that's a big part of what's going on. So that physical arousal can sometimes happen when something sexually relevant in our environment kind of activates us. So which explains why sometimes if we're watching a scene in a film and someone starts kissing, we might suddenly feel a bit turned on, or there's someone having sex, or we see someone really attractive, or we're walking down the street and we catch eyes with a stranger, or all of these things that can give us that kind of boost of arousal. And sometimes this happens for people in situations that they find really embarrassing. They have a physio appointment and they're not attracted to their physiotherapist, but it just happens that they are like massaging their thighs and they think, oh God, this is really uncomfortable. I suddenly feel a bit turned on. But I'm not attracted to them. And then we feel shame or we feel confused. And again, that's an example of us reading the situation. Now, if we are in a sexual situation with our partner and we really want to kind of be emotionally close to them and connected with them, but we've been having painful intercourse recently, whether due to a condition like vulvodynia or vaginismus. For men, there are conditions like Peyronie's disease. But sex has been uncomfortable or painful recently. And what starts to happen is, although we might be in this kind of open headspace for something sexual to happen with our partner, we are starting to feel tense, we are starting to feel anxious, we are starting to feel like we'd rather avoid. And that is becoming a stressor. We're not able to be in the moment and to focus on what feels good and what we are enjoying because we are in a stress response. And I'm giving obvious examples to illustrate the points kind of clearly, but we aren't going to be able to be fully in the moment when we are fearing what might be coming. And it's because sex has started to become something which is not offering us what it used to, isn't offering us fun, pleasure, connection. It's offering us stress, fear, pain, discomfort. And that is quite a confusing thing for us to try and work out.
It's so interesting to think about that the body and mind can act so independently when, again, it feels like something that we've been kind of fed it will sort itself out. You're going to be turned on when you should. And if I decide that I, want to have sex with my partner, my body's going to listen. If I'm at the physio and I get an erection, that's really embarrassing because that must mean X, Y, Z about me. And it's the narrative that we create again.
But so many of us, our mind wanders during sex and we're not all kind of fully in the moment 100% of the time, but it's when we are unable to pull our attention back. And it might be something simple like someone, so many of us get into bed with our to-do lists. We have our phones next to us, we're starting to make out with our partner, and then our phone's buzzing, we're thinking, is that work? Is that my boss? Maybe that's that thing I've been waiting for all day. Should I? And even that's a perfect example. Or we are like getting into bed with our partners and we can kind of get the feeling from them that they're slightly in the mood, and we look over and the pile of laundry that we've been meaning to do all day is right there, and we think, oh, that is so annoying. I really wanted that done because tomorrow morning this is happening. And because our attention is in our thoughts, what's physically happening in our bodies is not getting that attention because we cannot be in two places at once. And attention is what we need during sex to turn up the volume on the sensations that we're experiencing and focusing on our bodies. There is numerous pieces of research on mindful sex. One by a Canadian professor called Dr. Laurie Brotto.
I have an interview with her next week. I'm very excited to speak with her.
Incredible. She's been on my podcast. Her book is amazing. She's fantastic. But her research shows that not only did mindfulness programs increase the subjective experience of someone's arousal, so I'm feeling more turned on, I'm noticing my arousal more, but also the objective measures of it, so increased blood flow to the vagina. So the body actually responded. It wasn't just that people felt more turned on, it was actually that they were more turned on.
Wow, that's powerful.
Our attention is huge, plays a huge role in sex.
I'm like, put that on a fridge magnet.
Or a t-shirt.
Yeah.
Well, please send me one when you make it.
That's amazing. One more kind of question before we end this segment and go over into the Patreon exclusive extended version. This whole show is about bringing therapeutic insights, academic insights to the listeners. As a sex therapist, what is one thing you wish that people knew? A myth you wish you could dispel?
So I think the myth that I would really like to bust, which leaks into so many others, is that sex is only penis and vagina penetration. You know, sex is intercourse. And that's what most people say when they mean sex. And a lot of sex education, which essentially is reproduction education, basically models around this idea of sex. It's incredibly heteronormative. It's really ableist. What we're saying is, if that's not the relationship that you're in, whether those body parts are present, then you're not having sex. That people whose bodies don't function in that way or can't function in that way are not having sex. That people that don't have a preference for that aren't having sex. And then that's completely kind of contradicted by the fact that we have things like oral sex, and then we say, but that's not sex.
Yeah,
well, that's not real sex. And you're like, but it's in the name. This real sex, inverted commas, is intercourse, and everything else is not real sex or is somehow lesser than. And even our language, so foreplay, dictates that it's something that's done before or in advance of something else.
Yeah, the real sex.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So, and actually when we start to dismantle that a bit, people have much better sex lives. They have a wider definition of sex, start to explore sex in new ways. You're thinking, what is it that feels good for me? What is it that I enjoy? What is it that I'm connecting with, either on my own or with someone else? And Emily Nagoski, who's an absolute icon, always talks about how pleasure is the measure. And it's a phrase that I repeat from her again and again and again, because I really would love, if we're going to think about a myth, how we can start breaking that down and focusing on that side of it. Because also, if we're saying, okay, that's the only thing that counts as sex by definition, and people are having a problematic time with that type of sex, we are limiting them to having a type of sex which isn't working for them and isn't feeling good for them and they are not enjoying. And it's so much bigger than that. And I realised that we didn't answer the original question, which was all the reasons that people come to therapy for. So we obviously touched on desire, communication, and I work with lots of people with sexual dysfunctions. So whether that's erectile dysfunction, difficulties with ejaculation, people struggling to orgasm, sexual pain conditions, so things like vaginismus, vulvodynia, when sex changes, people trying to conceive is often a big one, or postnatally, people having kids, sexual trauma, anxiety. But my biggest motivation for doing the podcast and the book was assuring people that so many of the conversations I'm having in the therapy room, I don't think would need to happen, would even bring people to therapy if we had a better sexual culture.
And hopefully that can be a first step. Thank you for your expertise. I feel like I could talk to you for hours yet. But I recognize that's not possible today. We might have to have you back. If
3-part series.
Absolutely. Like, honestly, I feel like we've touched on so many interesting topics and just kind of scraped the surface. And I'm like, I would love to deep dive on so many of these things.
Just come to Canada for a week.
Oh yeah, exactly. Come out to Vancouver. It's really nice out here. So once again, Kate has a podcast called the Sexual Wellness Sessions Podcast. She also has written a book. If you have further questions, if you want more answers, the book is called The Science of Sex, Every Question About Your Sex Life Answered. All of that will be linked in the description. It'll be linked in the show notes. And we are now going to answer a few audience questions over on the Patreon extended episode. But for the rest of the listeners, thank you, Kate, for being here. We really appreciate your time. Thanks for listening. You can also access all of our extended cut episodes with bonus content from every single guest over on Patreon at patreon.com/AlenaJoy. That's patreon.com/ALAYNAJoy. And be sure to follow us on Instagram at sleepingaroundpod for updates, teasers, episode discussions, and more. This episode was produced by Elena Joy and Danae Fender and edited by Lucian Brinkley. See you next time, back here on the couch.